The marble corridors of the Hart Senate Office Building buzzed with the kind of electric anticipation that only came when Washington's most polarizing figures were about to collide in public view. Today's Senate Judiciary Committee hearing on constitutional rights in the digital age had drawn an unusually large crowd, with C-SPAN cameras positioned strategically to capture every moment of what promised to be a contentious discussion between America's political generations. The hearing room itself was a monument to governmental gravitas. Soaring ceilings adorned with classical moldings, walls lined with oil paintings of long-dead senators, and rows of polished mahogany that had witnessed decades of constitutional debates. The committee table, arranged in a horseshoe configuration, seated 15 senators whose collective experience spanned nearly 3 centuries of American political life. At the center of it all sat Senator John Neely Kennedy of Louisiana, his silver hair catching the harsh fluorescent lights that television crews demanded. At 73, Kennedy carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who'd spent decades navigating the treacherous waters of constitutional law, first as a practicing attorney and later as one of the Senate's most thoughtful voices on jurisprudential matters. His navy suit was pressed, but unpretentious. His tortoiseshell glasses practical rather than fashionable, and his demeanor carried the patient authority of someone who'd learned that wisdom often came disguised as folksy simplicity. Today's hearing had been called to examine how constitutional protections applied to digital communications, social media platforms, and the rapidly evolving landscape of online discourse. It was precisely the kind of complex, nuanced issue that required both deep constitutional knowledge and an understanding of modern technology, a combination that few possessed and even fewer could articulate clearly to the American public. The witness table faced the senators like a dock before a tribunal, and today it held an unusual collection of experts: tech industry executives in expensive suits, civil liberties lawyers with briefcases full of precedents, and most notably, Alexandria Ocasio Cortez, the 34-year-old representative from New York whose meteoric rise to political prominence had made her both a progressive icon and a conservative lightning rod. AOC, as she was universally known, sat with the confident posture of someone accustomed to being the youngest and most photographed person in any room. Her burgundy blazer was perfectly tailored, her hair styled with a kind of precision that suggested awareness of the dozen cameras trained on her every expression. At 34, she represented everything that modern progressive politics claimed to embody: youth, diversity, social media savvy, and an unshakable belief that traditional institutions needed to be fundamentally reimagined for a new century. 20 feet behind the witness table, in the section reserved for Senate staff and pages, sat Emma Chen, a 22-year-old recent graduate from Georgetown University who'd landed a coveted position as a Senate page through a combination of academic excellence and genuine passion for constitutional law. Emma's presence in the room represented a small miracle of meritocracy. The daughter of immigrants who'd opened a small restaurant in suburban Virginia, she'd worked her way through college while maintaining a 4.0 GPA in political science. For Emma, Senator Kennedy wasn't just another politician. He was something approaching a hero. She'd written her senior thesis on constitutional interpretation, drawing heavily on Kennedy's speeches and legal writings. Where her classmates saw an old white man clinging to outdated ideas, Emma saw a brilliant legal mind who could explain complex constitutional principles in language that regular Americans could understand. She'd watched hours of his committee hearings, marveling at his ability to cut through political rhetoric to expose the fundamental legal questions at stake. Today, however, Emma felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. The generational and ideological clash between Kennedy and AOC had been building for months through dueling press releases and social media posts. AOC's followers saw Kennedy as a relic of a bygone era, while Kennedy's supporters viewed AOC as a dangerous radical who didn't understand the constitutional foundations of American democracy. Committee Chairman Senator Patrick Leahy called the hearing to order with 3 sharp raps of his gavel, his Vermont accent cutting through the murmur of conversation that had filled the room. Today we examine how our constitutional framework applies to the digital communications that increasingly define American discourse, he announced, his words carrying the weight of someone who'd presided over countless such hearings during his 4 decades in the Senate. The first hour proceeded with a predictable rhythm of congressional hearings: opening statements from committee members, technical presentations from industry witnesses, and the careful dance of questions designed more for soundbites than genuine inquiry. Kennedy listened with the patient attention of someone who'd mastered the art of extracting meaningful information from bureaucratic testimony, occasionally taking notes in the careful script of someone who'd learned to write before computers existed. AOC, meanwhile, seemed to vibrate with barely contained energy. Her responses to questions were sharp, passionate, and delivered with a kind of social media-ready precision that made her a master of viral political content. When asked about platform liability for user-generated content, she spoke eloquently about the need for aggressive action to protect vulnerable communities from hate speech and disinformation. The tension began building when Senator Kennedy's turn for questions arrived. He adjusted his glasses with deliberate slowness, a gesture that Emma had learned signaled his transition from passive observer to active interrogator. "Ms. Ocasio Cortez," Kennedy began, his Louisiana drawl immediately distinguishing his voice from the clipped tones of his Northeastern colleagues. "I appreciate your passion for protecting folks from harmful content. That's a noble goal, and one I think we all share." His tone was respectful, almost grandfatherly, which only seemed to heighten AOC's visible impatience. She leaned forward slightly, her expression suggesting she was bracing for an attack disguised as courtesy. "But I'm curious," Kennedy continued, "about how your proposals would work within our existing constitutional framework. The First Amendment doesn't just protect speech we like, it protects speech that offends us, speech that makes us uncomfortable, even speech that we find morally reprehensible." AOC's response was immediate and sharp. "Senator, with respect, that's exactly the kind of outdated thinking that's allowed hate speech to flourish online. We're not talking about the 1700s anymore. We're talking about platforms that can amplify dangerous misinformation to millions of people in seconds." The words "outdated thinking" hung in the air like a challenge. Emma felt her cheeks flush with anger on Kennedy's behalf, while several committee members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. In the world of Senate protocol, such a direct dismissal of a senior member's perspective bordered on the insulting. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but Emma noticed a slight tightening around his eyes.
"I appreciate that perspective, Representative, but the Constitution isn't outdated just because it's old. The principles it embodies, due process, equal protection, freedom of expression, those aren't artifacts of the 1700s. They're timeless safeguards against government overreach."
AOC's patience, never her strongest virtue, began to fray visibly.
Senator Kennedy, I understand you've been here a long time, but maybe it's time to recognize that some of us actually understand the modern world. Your approach to constitutional interpretation is holding back progress on issues that affect real people's lives.
The phrase, "been here a long time," carried obvious implications about age and relevance. Emma's hands clenched into fists as she watched Kennedy absorb what was clearly intended as a put-down. But Kennedy remained unruffled, his voice maintaining its characteristic warmth.
"Well, now, Representative, I reckon there's always something new to learn. That's why I'm asking these questions. Help me understand how we can protect people from harmful speech while still preserving the principle that government doesn't get to decide what ideas are acceptable."
It was a perfectly reasonable question, delivered with genuine curiosity. But AOC seemed to interpret it as either obtuseness or bad faith. Her voice rose slightly, carrying the edge of someone who'd grown tired of explaining obvious truths to willfully ignorant elders.
Senator, this isn't complicated. Platforms have terms of service. They can remove content that violates those terms. The government can require them to be more aggressive about enforcement. We're not talking about censorship. We're talking about accountability.
Kennedy nodded thoughtfully.
"I see. So in your view, private companies can restrict speech in ways that the government couldn't directly?"
Obviously.
AOC replied, her tone suggesting that the question itself was evidence of Kennedy's disconnection from reality.
Private companies aren't bound by the First Amendment. This is basic constitutional law, Senator.
The condescension in her voice was unmistakable now. Emma felt her face burning with indignation, while C-SPAN's cameras captured every nuance of the exchange for the millions of Americans watching at home. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful.
"That's an interesting perspective, Representative. Though I wonder if it's quite that simple when we're talking about platforms that have become essential forums for public discourse.
AOC's response revealed the full extent of her frustration. Senator, no offense, but your generation's approach to these issues is exactly why we can't make progress. You keep talking about constitutional principles like they're sacred texts that can never be reinterpreted for modern circumstances. The phrase, your generation, landed like a slap. Around the room, senators and staff members exchanged glances. Even in the rough-and-tumble world of congressional hearings, such an openly dismissive reference to a colleague's age was unusual. Kennedy's smile remained in place, but Emma could see something shift in his posture. A subtle straightening that suggested the courtly patience was reaching its limits. "Representative," Kennedy said, his voice still calm but carrying a new undertone of steel. "I've been studying constitutional law since before you were born. I've argued cases before the Supreme Court, written law review articles on First Amendment jurisprudence, and spent decades grappling with exactly these questions of how eternal principles apply to changing circumstances." AOC waved a hand dismissively. "And that's exactly the problem. You're stuck in the past, applying 18th century solutions to 21st century problems. Maybe it's time for fresh perspectives from people who actually understand how modern technology works." The insult was now explicit and undeniable. Emma felt tears of anger welling in her eyes as she watched one of her heroes being publicly disrespected by someone who seemed to believe that youth alone qualified as expertise. But if AOC thought she'd scored a decisive blow, she was about to learn otherwise. Kennedy removed his glasses and cleaned them with deliberate slowness, a gesture that Emma recognized as his preparation for delivering a lesson that the recipient would not soon forget. When he replaced his glasses and looked directly at AOC, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime mastering his craft. "Representative Ocasio Cortez," he said, "you mentioned fresh perspectives from people who understand modern technology. That's a fair point. But let me ask you something. When you were studying economics at Boston University, did your professors teach you that economic principles discovered decades or centuries ago were automatically invalid because of their age?" AOC's eyes narrowed. She sensed a trap but couldn't see its dimensions. Kennedy continued, his tone remaining conversational but gaining focus. "Because I'm looking here at your undergraduate thesis, The Effect of Cesses on Economic Development, and I notice you cited Adam Smith quite extensively. Now, Adam Smith published The Wealth of Nations in 1776. By your logic, shouldn't his ideas about market economics be considered hopelessly outdated?" The reference to her thesis caught AOC completely off guard. She clearly hadn't expected Kennedy to have done that level of research on her academic background. That's different," she stammered. "Economic principles and constitutional law are different fields." Kennedy's smile returned, warmer now, but with an edge that suggested a master teacher about to deliver an unforgettable lesson. "Are they? Both deal with fundamental questions of how human beings organize themselves, how power should be distributed, and how competing interests can be balanced fairly. Both require us to understand timeless principles while adapting to changing circumstances." He leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on the cadence of someone settling in to tell a story. "You know, Representative, I was reading your law school writings from Boston University. Excellent work, by the way. In particular, your note on democratic participation in the digital age made some fascinating points about how technology can enhance civic engagement." AOC looked wary now, unsure where this was heading. "What struck me," Kennedy continued, "was how you argued that digital platforms could serve the same democratizing function that pamphleteers served during the Revolutionary War. You wrote, and I'm quoting here, 'The framers understood that democracy requires robust public discourse, and they designed the First Amendment to protect that discourse, even when it challenges established power structures.'" The room had gone completely silent. Emma realized she was holding her breath. Kennedy's voice grew stronger. "That's a brilliant insight, Representative, and it's exactly why the constitutional principles you're so eager to dismiss aren't outdated. They're eternal. The technology changes, but the fundamental human need for free expression remains constant. AOC's face had gone pale as she realized that Kennedy was using her own academic work to dismantle her argument. The framers didn't protect free speech because they lived in a simpler time, Kennedy continued. They protected it because they understood that every generation would face the temptation to silence voices that challenged the prevailing orthodoxy. They knew that the people in power, whether government officials or tech executives, would always find reasons why certain speech was too dangerous to permit. He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the knockout blow. In your law review note, you warned against allowing unelected corporate leaders to determine the boundaries of acceptable discourse. You argued that such power should be subject to constitutional constraints precisely because it affects the democratic process itself. AOC opened her mouth to respond, but Kennedy wasn't finished. So when you tell me that my constitutional concerns are outdated, you're not just disagreeing with me. You're disagreeing with the brilliant young law student who wrote those words just a few years ago. The question isn't whether we need to adapt constitutional principles to new circumstances. The question is whether we remember why those principles matter in the first place. The silence that followed was deafening. AOC sat frozen, clearly struggling to find a response that wouldn't further expose the contradiction between her current position and her own academic work. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. My views have evolved as I've gained more experience in office. Kennedy nodded with genuine kindness. Of course they have. That's natural and healthy. But wisdom doesn't just come from new experiences. It comes from understanding how new experiences fit into the larger patterns of human behavior that we've been grappling with for centuries. He leaned back in his chair, his tone softening. Representative, I don't dismiss your concerns about online harassment and misinformation. They're real and serious problems that require thoughtful solutions. But the law student who wrote about democratic participation understood something important. The cure for bad speech isn't censorship, it's more speech. AOC looked up at him, and for the first time in the hearing, her expression showed something other than combative confidence. There was uncertainty there, and perhaps a grudging recognition that she'd underestimated her opponent. The Constitution isn't outdated, Kennedy continued. It's not a relic of the past that needs to be discarded for modern solutions. It's a framework for addressing eternal human problems that happen to manifest themselves through contemporary technology. He gestured around the room, encompassing the marble and mahogany and oil paintings that surrounded them. All of this, the institutions, the traditions, the careful processes, they're not here because we worship the past. They're here because human nature doesn't change. The tools change, the platforms change, but the fundamental challenge of balancing freedom with responsibility remains constant. The committee chairman looked around the room, clearly sensing that something significant had just occurred. Does the representative wish to respond? AOC took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice carried a humility that hadn't been there before. Senator Kennedy, I apologize for my earlier comments about your age and experience. That was inappropriate and unprofessional. Kennedy's smile was warm and genuine. No apology necessary, Representative. Passion for important issues sometimes gets the better of all of us. That's human nature too. I still believe we need stronger action on online harassment and misinformation, AOC continued. But I acknowledge that my approach may need to be more constitutionally grounded. Now that, Kennedy said, sounds like the beginning of a productive conversation. Maybe the old dog and the young firecracker can learn something from each other after all. For the first time during the hearing, AOC smiled, not the practiced political smile she wore for cameras, but something more genuine. I'd like that, Senator. As the hearing moved on to other witnesses and other questions, Emma Chen wiped tears from her eyes. She'd just witnessed something rare in Washington, a moment when genuine intellectual engagement triumphed over political theater, when experience and youth found common ground in shared respect for both innovation and wisdom. Later, as the hearing concluded and senators filed out of the room, Emma approached Kennedy with the stack of papers she'd been asked to deliver to his office. "Senator," she said, her voice still thick with emotion, that was incredible." Kennedy smiled at her with the warmth he reserved for young people who reminded him why he'd entered public service in the first place. "Thank you, Emma. But the real credit goes to Representative Ocasio Cortez. It takes courage to acknowledge when you might need to reconsider your approach." "But how did you know about her law school work?" Emma asked. Kennedy's eyes twinkled with mischief. "Well, when someone's going to question your relevance based on your age, it's probably wise to do your homework. Turns out, the representative was once a pretty thoughtful student of constitutional law. Maybe she just needed to be reminded of what she already knew." As they walked together down the marble corridor, Kennedy's voice took on the tone of a teacher delivering a final lesson. "Emma, remember this. Wisdom isn't about being right all the time. It's about understanding that we're all wrong sometimes, and that the best way to find truth is through respectful dialogue between people who disagree." He paused at the elevator, his expression growing serious. "The representative called me outdated, and maybe in some ways I am, but the principles I defend aren't mine. They belong to every generation of Americans. My job isn't to preserve them unchanged, but to help each new generation understand why they matter." As the elevator doors closed, Emma reflected on what she'd witnessed. In an age of social media soundbites and political tribalism, she'd seen two intelligent people from different generations find their way to mutual respect through the shared language of constitutional principles. The lesson wasn't that age trumped youth, or that experience mattered more than fresh perspectives. The lesson was that democracy worked best when people of different backgrounds and viewpoints could engage with each other's ideas honestly and respectfully. Senator Kennedy had defended more than just constitutional interpretation that day. He'd defended the possibility that Americans could still talk to each other across the divides of age, ideology, and experience. And in doing so, he'd reminded everyone watching that the real strength of American democracy wasn't in its institutions or traditions, but in its capacity for citizens to change each other's minds through the patient work of persuasion and mutual respect. Sometimes the most radical act in a polarized world is simply treating your opponents as fellow human beings capable of reason and growth. In a city where political combat often felt like total war, Kennedy had shown that there was still room for the kind of gracious disagreement that made democratic governance possible. If this story of bridging generational divides through respectful dialogue inspired you, consider supporting our channel. Your donations help us continue sharing these powerful tales of wisdom, respect, and the possibility of finding common ground even in our most polarized moments. Click the link below to contribute, and let's keep celebrating the conversations that remind us of our shared humanity.